years ago, when I was finishing my last semester of college, I moved into the cheapest apartment I could find because I was running out of money, and I only needed somewhere to survive for a few months. I wasn't trying to start over or find some charming little place with character. I just needed 4 walls, a working shower, and something close enough to campus that I could make it to my morning classes without spending half my paycheck on gas. The building I ended up in sat behind a discount grocery store on the older side of town, the kind of place you barely notice unless you already live there. 3 floors, yellowed siding, thin metal railings, and a front hallway that always smelled faintly like wet carpet and bleach. Most of the tenants were older, retired people. A guy on the first floor who chain smoked on his balcony, no matter the weather. A woman across the hall from me who watched game shows loud enough that I could hear the applause through my door every evening at 7. It wasn't a scary place. If anything, it was just depressing in a very ordinary way. The landlord, Rick, showed me the unit in less than 10 minutes. He unlocked the door, flicked on the kitchen light, pointed out the breaker box and the laundry room, and kept repeating that it was a good short-term setup. For a student, the apartment itself was narrow and tired-looking, with old blinds, cheap beige paint, and one of those refrigerators that hummed so loudly at night it sounded like someone exhaling in the next room. But the rent was low enough that I could manage it, and at that point, that was all I cared about. The only thing I remember asking about was the apartment next door, mostly because the doormat outside, it looked sun-faded and brittle, like it had been sitting there untouched for years. Rick glanced over at it and said, "That one is vacant. Has been for a long time." I asked why, and he shrugged like it wasn't worth explaining. "Needs work. Plumbing issue. I'll deal with it eventually." That answer was good enough for me. If anything, I liked the idea of an empty unit beside mine. Less noise, less hassle. The first week I lived there, nothing happened that I couldn't explain. My routine was dull, in the way routines are supposed to be. I'd leave for campus around 8, sit through class half awake, work my library shift in the afternoon, then come back around 9 or 10 with takeout or microwave food, and spend the rest of the night studying. The building got very quiet after midnight. Not peaceful exactly, just still. I could hear pipes ticking sometimes, or the elevator dragging itself upward, or someone coughing faintly in another unit. It was an old building, and old buildings always make noise. That's what I told myself the first time I heard footsteps coming from the apartment next door. It was late, maybe around 1 in the morning, and I was at my kitchen table trying to finish a paper when I heard a slow movement through the wall beside me. Not loud, just a few measured steps. Then silence. I stopped typing and listened for a few seconds, but nothing else happened. So I figured either Rick had lied about the apartment being empty, or the sound was carrying strangely from another floor. The second time I heard it was 2 nights later. Same general time, same slow pacing, like someone crossing a room and stopping. I remember rolling my eyes at myself, because by then, I'd already started noticing when the building settled down enough for those sounds to stand out. The third time was different only because it happened long enough for me to pay attention to it properly. I checked my phone, and it was 2:13 a.m. I know that because I ended up fixating on the time afterward, like somehow having an exact number made the whole thing easier to sort out. I sat there in silence while the footsteps continued for maybe 20 seconds, moving from one side of the neighboring apartment to the other, then stopping abruptly. I didn't feel afraid then. Annoyed, maybe. Curious. Mostly, I just wanted to know why an apparently vacant unit seemed busiest in the middle of the night. The obvious answer was that it wasn't actually vacant. Rick either didn't know someone was using it, or didn't care. That explanation made enough sense that I held onto it for another week. The problem was that the pattern got harder to ignore the more I noticed it. The sounds never happened during the day. They never happened while my TV was on, or when I had music playing. Only late at night, when I was alone, and the building felt empty enough that every small noise had a shape to it. And once I started listening for them, I realized they didn't feel random. One night, I got up from the couch and walked into the kitchen for water, and as soon as I moved, I heard movement next door too, keeping pace with me along the shared wall. When I stopped at the sink, the footsteps stopped too. I stood there for a while, glass in my hand, telling myself that meant absolutely nothing. Another night, I tested it without even meaning to. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom and heard one slow step on the other side of the wall, then another. I spat, rinsed, stepped into the hallway, and the movement matched mine for 3 or 4 seconds before it went still again. That was the point where I started sleeping badly, not because I thought I was in danger, but because I couldn't stop trying to explain it. Sleep deprivation makes you stupid in very specific ways. It doesn't just make you tired. It makes you willing to accept explanations that barely hold together, because they still better than admitting you don't understand what's happening. So I told myself the building's plumbing ran through that wall. I told myself sound was echoing up from another unit. I told myself there was a repair worker coming in at night for some reason Rick hadn't bothered to mention. All of that felt shaky, but it was still better than the alternative. I brought it up to Rick a few days later, when I saw him outside the building, smoking beside the dumpster. I kept it casual. I said I thought maybe someone was using the vacant apartment, because I'd been hearing footsteps late at night. He didn't even pause before saying, "Nobody's in there." I laughed a little and said, "Then your pipes sound exactly like walking." He gave me this tired smile that felt more dismissive than reassuring and said, "Old buildings carry noise in weird ways." Then he changed the subject. That should have settled it. It almost did. But the same night, when I got home a little after midnight, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. I was standing in the hallway, digging through my bag for my keys, when I happened to glance at the bottom of the vacant unit's door. The hall light behind me was weak and yellow, but it was enough to show the narrow strip of darkness under the door. At first, I thought nothing of it. Then I realized the shape of that darkness was wrong. It wasn't an even shadow. It looked blocked, as if someone was standing directly on the other side of the door, close enough to cut off the light. From inside the apartment, I remember feeling a weird flash of relief before anything else. Relief because it meant there was a real explanation after all. Someone was in there. I wasn't imagining the sounds. I knocked once, lightly, because I suddenly felt awkward about being caught staring at someone else's door. Hello, no answer. The shadow didn't move. I knocked again, a little harder. Hey, sorry, I just wanted to ask if you live here. Still nothing. That silence got under my skin much faster than it should have. I took one step closer and bent slightly, trying to see if I could make anything out through the gap under the door. The shadow shifted, not away from the door, toward it. I backed up so fast, I hit my shoulder against my own wall. I got inside my apartment, locked the door, and stood there for a full minute feeling stupid and embarrassed, with my heart pounding way harder than it should have been. I was already starting to calm down when my doorknob turned, slowly, not a violent rattle, not someone trying to force their way in, just a careful twist to check whether I'd locked it. I froze in the middle of my kitchen and stared at the door while the knob eased back into place. A few seconds later, from the other side of the wall, beside my living room, I heard 3 soft knocks. I didn't sleep at all that night, and by morning, I still couldn't tell which part bothered me. The fact that someone had been standing there in a supposedly empty apartment, or the fact that whoever it was had followed me to my door without making a sound. The next day, I kept telling myself that if there had been an actual person in the vacant unit, there had to be a boring explanation for why they hadn't answered. Maybe it was some maintenance guy Rick let in after hours. Maybe it was a homeless person using the place to sleep. Maybe I'd startled whoever it was, and they were trying not to get caught. None of those possibilities made me feel good. Exactly, but they were at least things I could imagine reporting to somebody without sounding insane. So I went looking for Rick again that afternoon and found him in the parking lot, scraping old registration stickers off the windshield of his truck. I told him someone had been inside the vacant unit the night before. I described the shadow under the door, the silence, the doorknob turning after I went into my apartment. The longer I talked, the flatter his expression got. When I finished, he looked past me toward the building for a few seconds and then said, "I'll show you." He took me upstairs with his ring of keys, unlocked the neighboring apartment, and stepped aside like he was trying to prove a point. The place was empty, not empty in the sense of nobody home, but stripped, stale, and dead-looking, like a room that had been shut too long. There was no furniture, no boxes, no tools, no sign anyone had been staying there. Sunlight pushed weakly through the blinds and showed a layer of dust on the floor, except for a few long scrape marks across the living room boards, as if something heavy had been dragged from one side of the room to the other again and again. The air smelled damp, with that sweet, rotten edge. Old leaks leave behind inside walls. Rick walked through the place quickly, tapping the bathroom light switch, even though nothing happened, opening a kitchen cabinet, checking the bedroom closet, then turning back to me with this irritated look that said he thought the tour should have settled the matter. I pointed at the scrape marks and asked what had made them. He barely looked. Probably old furniture. I asked why the power seemed off, if he was supposedly keeping the unit ready to repair, and he said he'd shut most of it down months ago. When I asked again whether anyone had keys besides him, he gave me a sharper answer than before. Nobody else living in there. Then he locked the door, pocketed the key, and walked away before I could ask anything else. That should have embarrassed me into letting it go. Instead, it made me feel worse, because it meant one of two things. Either Rick was lying about something, or what I'd seen the night before had been there, while the apartment itself was still empty. That evening, I called my friend Natalie while I was making ramen and told her the whole story in a deliberately joking tone, because if I said it lightly enough, maybe it would stay light. She listened longer than I expected, then said, "You know, this sounds like the beginning of something you should not stay around long enough to understand." Right, I laughed at that, but only because the alternative was admitting. She sounded reasonable. Around midnight, I tried to study on the couch with the TV on low, and for a while, the noise from the building covered everything. Then the living room light flickered once, not enough to plunge the room into darkness, just a brief dip. A minute later, it happened again, and under the sound of the television, I heard those footsteps next door, slow and deliberate, moving along the wall behind my couch. I muted the TV. The footsteps stopped immediately. I sat there listening to the refrigerator hum and the hallway vent rattle, waiting for them to start again. Nothing, I told myself, that was good proof it was just a coincidence or some structural noise that only sounded human when I was already tense. Then I got up to turn the television off completely, and as soon as my feet touched the floor, the footsteps resumed on the other side of the wall, matching me, kitchen to living room to hallway. Stop, stop. I stood there long enough that my legs started to ache. No sound. I took one slow step backward. One slow step answered it through the wall. That was the first moment I felt genuine fear instead of annoyance or curiosity. It wasn't just that the sound followed me. It was the patience of it. Whatever was making it never rushed. It didn't need to. It moved like something that already knew I wasn't going anywhere. I ended up sleeping with the bedroom light on, or trying to. Sometime after 2, I woke up because I thought I'd heard water running. At first, I figured it was my bathroom sink, but the sound was too muffled, too distant. It seemed to be coming from the neighboring apartment. I lay there listening while the water ran for maybe 10 seconds, stopped, then started again in a quick burst. After that came the scrape of something dragging across the floor, then silence, then, very softly, 3 knocks from the wall beside my bed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe normally. I just lay there until dawn, staring at the shape of the blinds and telling myself I'd pack a bag after class and stay somewhere else for a couple nights. But daylight has a way of making promises feel dramatic. By noon, I was tired enough that everything from the night before seemed ridiculous. I went to campus, sat through a review session, drank too much coffee, and came home late with groceries and a headache. The hall was empty when I got there. The faded doormat still sat outside the vacant unit. Nothing about it looked unusual, except that I had started measuring normal by whether or not. It felt like something might be standing just behind that door. I unlocked my apartment, put my groceries away, and noticed a folded sheet of paper on the kitchen floor near the wall I shared with the empty unit. I knew I hadn't left it there. It looked like a piece torn from a notebook, folded twice into a square. For about 10 seconds, I honestly considered throwing it straight in the trash without opening it, because the sight of it made my skin crawl in a way I can fully explain. Instead, I crouched down and picked it up. It was dry and brittle, like old paper that had spent years in a drawer. Inside, in faded blue ink, there were 3 words written in blocky, uneven handwriting. Don T. let IT in. I stared at that note for so long, my knees started hurting from the position I was in. I checked both locks on my front door. I checked the windows. I checked the crack under my apartment door, in case someone had slipped it through from the hall, but the fold was too thick for that. My first rational thought was that it had come from somewhere in the wall, maybe blown out through an opening near the baseboard when the air kicked on. That was absurd enough that I latched onto it immediately. I spent the next half hour inspecting every inch of the shared wall until I found a hairline gap where the trim near the floor had pulled slightly away. It wasn't big, just enough to wedge the corner of a fingernail into. I should have felt relieved to find it. Instead, I felt watched the entire time I was crouched there. I finally went down to the hardware store 2 blocks away, bought painter S-tape, foam sealant, and one of those cheap rubber door wedges, and came back feeling stupid but determined. If the problem was sound carrying through old gaps, I could seal them. If someone had access to the walls, I could at least make it harder. I taped the trim. I sealed the little opening. I pushed the wedge under my front door that night and shoved a dining chair beneath the knob for good measure. The whole process made me feel calmer in a practical way. For the first time in days, I felt like I was doing something instead of waiting. The apartment stayed quiet until almost 1 in the morning. No footsteps, no knocks, no flickering lights. I remember sitting on the couch, actually starting to believe I solved it by doing something embarrassingly simple. Then, from the other side of the shared wall, I heard a slow scrape travel along the drywall from floor level to about shoulder height, like fingernails being dragged upward through paint. It stopped directly beside the spot I had sealed. A second later, something knocked once from inside the wall, then again. Then the new foam around the trim began to bulge outward, as if pressure were building behind it. I backed away so quickly, I nearly tripped over the coffee table. The bulge in the fresh foam held for a second, then relaxed, then pushed out again, harder. enough to split the white line of sealant and send a dry cracking sound through the room. I don't know why that frightened me more than the footsteps had. Maybe because I'd done something concrete, something stupidly practical and normal, and instead of making things better, it felt like I'd just given whatever was in there a specific place to answer from. I killed the living room light without thinking, which was its own kind of mistake, because the room immediately reflected the hall light coming under my front door and the dim glow of the microwave clock. And in that low light, every angle of the apartment looked unfamiliar. I stood there listening. Nothing, no footsteps next door, no knocking, just that low electrical hum old apartments always make when you've gone still enough to hear them. After about a minute, I told myself the pressure in the wall had shifted because of the foam expanding. That was actually plausible. I held onto it hard enough to go get my phone and take pictures, because if it was something physical, I wanted proof in the morning that I hadn't imagined it. The trim looked warped. The foam was split. That was real. I took 3 pictures, zoomed in on the crack, and while I was crouched there, the camera app caught a sound I hadn't heard with my own ears. A soft exhale, very close to the microphone, from the direction of the wall. I jerked back and dropped the phone. The sound stopped immediately. I grabbed the phone off the floor, replayed the last few seconds of video, and there it was again, my own breathing, the refrigerator hum, and underneath both of those, one slow breath that wasn't mine. I packed a duffel bag in less than 5 minutes and drove to Natalie S. She let me in wearing pajamas and didn't even bother asking whether I was overreacting anymore. She just looked at my face, moved a pile of laundry off the couch, and said I could stay as long as I needed. I wish I had taken that offer seriously right then. Instead, I treated it like a temporary reset. I slept maybe 3 hours on her couch, woke up with my neck aching, and spent the next day telling myself I'd go back once the sun was up, collect a few more things, maybe ask someone from the building to walk through the place with me. That was the point where curiosity turned into something worse. Obsession, probably. Fear would told me to stay away. Obsession told me I needed to understand it enough to make sense of it. I skipped class again and went to the public library instead of campus, because I didn't want to be seen failing to hold my life together. I used one of their computers to look up old newspaper archives for the building address, and Walter Haynes, the tenant Rick, had finally admitted died next door years earlier. Most of what came up was nothing. Property notices, a brief mention of an ambulance response, nothing useful. Then I found a digitized local paper from the summer he died. The article was tiny, more like a community blurb than real reporting. Elderly tenant found deceased after neighbors complained of odor. No foul play suspected. The only reason I kept reading was because one sentence near the bottom mentioned that tenants on the same floor had reported hearing movement from his apartment for several nights after they believed he was already dead. The property manager at the time dismissed it as stress and suggestion. I must have read that sentence 10 times. It didn't prove anything supernatural. It did prove the pattern was older than Rick had admitted, and that other people had noticed it before Walter was ever found. On a different archive site, I found a scanned forum post from years later by someone who had apparently rented my unit for a month. Most of it was incoherent complaining about the landlord, but one line stood out. If you hear it pacing next door, Don T, answer the door. Don T, knock back. And Don T, sleep against that wall. That should have been enough for me to never go back. Instead, it made me think there might be rules. Rules meant a pattern. A pattern meant something you might survive if you understood it fast enough. Around 4 that afternoon, I drove back to the building with Natalie. That was my second attempt at solving it, if you want to call it that. Don T, go alone. Bring someone real, someone rested, someone who could tell me what was happening if I started missing obvious explanations. I also brought a cheap digital recorder from the campus media lab that ID signed out that morning, along with a roll of red tape and a screwdriver, because ID convinced myself I might pry off part of the baseboard and see where that dead space actually led. The apartment felt normal when we walked in. Too normal. Sunlight through the blinds, stale air, my half-packed things where ID left them. Natalie did a slow lap through every room and said, if this ends with me helping you find raccoons in the wall, I am going to be very upset. I laughed harder than the joke deserved. We set the recorder on the kitchen counter and let it run. I showed her the split foam and the warped trim near the floor. She crouched beside it and frowned. This was fresh. I told her I'd done it the night before. She ran a fingernail over the broken sealant and said it looked like something had pushed from behind, not expanded outward on its own. Hearing her say that out loud made the room feel colder, even though the thermostat was reading the same as always. While she boxed up dishes, I unscrewed the trim piece with shaking hands and gently pulled it back from the wall. There was a gap behind it, deeper than it should have been. Not huge, but more than the thickness of standard framing. My phone flashlight showed rough interior plaster, dust, and then darkness dropping away farther than I could immediately judge. I fed the screwdriver into the space and didn't hit anything for almost a foot. When I pulled it back out, the tip was damp. That made no sense. There was no active leak, no smell of fresh water, just that same damp, stale odor from next door. Natalie came over, took one look into the opening, and said, "No, absolutely not. We are not reaching into hidden spaces in your haunted apartment." I told her it wasn't haunted. I don't know why I said it. Habit, maybe, or pride. I threaded a strip of red tape along the inside edge anyway, leaving the end hanging out where I could tell. If anything tugged it deeper into the wall, that was another attempt to solve it, or at least verify it. Set a marker, create a control, see whether the space changed when I wasn't touching it. For the next half hour, nothing happened. We packed books. We loaded 2 boxes into my car. The recorder sat there, quietly collecting room tone. By the time the light outside started to fade, I had made the mistake of relaxing. I actually said, maybe it only acts up at night. Natalie looked at me and said, "That sentence alone means we should already be gone." She was right. I know that now, but just then, the recorder on the kitchen counter emitted a shrill burst of feedback, so sudden it made both of us jump at the exact same moment. From inside the wall, where ID removed the trim, there came 3 slow knocks from deep in the hidden space, not next door, not on the surface of the drywall, from farther in, as if something had been standing in that sealed darkness, listening to us work, and had decided, very politely, to announce itself. Neither of us moved for a second. It was the kind of silence that feels physical, like the air in the room has suddenly become heavier and denser around you. Natalie was the first one to speak, and even then, her voice came out much quieter than normal. "Tell me that was the pipes I wanted to." I actually opened my mouth with every intention of saying yes, because I could feel something in me trying desperately to shove the whole moment back into the category of ordinary problems. Old buildings knock, heat shifts, water lines move, but those 3 knocks had spacing, intention, a pause between each one, like someone choosing when to make the next sound. Before I could answer, the strip of red tape ID left hanging from the opening moved. At first, it just twitched, barely enough to notice. Then it drew inward an inch, then another, not fast, not yanked, slowly, steadily, like something on the other side was taking it between 2 fingers and pulling it deeper into the wall. Natalie made a sound ID never heard from her before, not quite a gasp and not quite a whimper, and grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. We both watched the tape disappear until only a short red tongue of it remained outside the opening. Then it stopped. A second later, from somewhere farther inside that hidden space, came the wet dragging sound again, moving away from us. That finally broke whatever spell I'd been under. I shoved the trim piece back against the wall, snatched the recorder off the counter, and told Natalie we were leaving right now. We didn't even lock the apartment. We carried boxes to the car like the place was on fire, breathing hard, not speaking unless it was absolutely necessary. Once we were inside, with the doors shut, Natalie looked at me and said, "You are not staying here again." "I am serious," I said. I knew, but I also knew by then that simply staying somewhere else hadn't stopped it from escalating. Every time I tried to avoid it, it came back stronger. The next time I returned, that thought was already in my head, even before we drove away, and I hated how quickly it had become normal to think that way. Back at Natalie's apartment, we played the recorder file on her laptop. For the first several minutes, it was just tape hiss, our voices, the sound of boxes sliding across the floor. Then, around the point where ID removed the trim, there was a low noise the recorder had captured better than either of us heard in person. Not breathing exactly, more like damp fabric being dragged through a narrow space. It moved from the far left channel to the right, which meant whatever made it had traveled behind the wall from the direction of the vacant apartment toward my living room. Then came the 3 knocks, loud and hollow. Underneath them, so faint we only caught it after replaying the section 3 times, was another sound, a voice, not clear words, more like the shape of speech, muffled by plaster and distance. I turned the volume up until the laptop speakers distorted, and we both leaned in. On the fourth replay, we heard it at the same time. Let in Natalie closed the laptop immediately. No, she said, I don't care if that S. Electronic interference. No, I didn't argue. I barely slept that night, and when I did drift off, I dreamed. I was back in the apartment, listening to someone move through the wall between rooms faster and faster, until the pattern stopped making sense. And it was somehow inside every wall at once. I woke up on Natalie S. couch at dawn, with my calf muscle cramping so badly I nearly shouted. When I rolled my pant leg up, there were dark, finger-shaped bruises around my right ankle. For a few seconds, I just stared at them without really processing what I was seeing. Natalie came into the room with coffee, saw my face, and asked what was wrong. I showed her. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked me whether I'd hurt myself moving boxes. I said maybe, but we both knew those marks hadn't been there the night before. They looked like someone had grabbed me hard enough to stop me from being pulled somewhere, or hard enough to pull me in the first place. That was the point where fear started turning into determination, because by then it felt less like a strange apartment problem and more like something that had selected me specifically. I skipped another day of class and went back to the library archives, this time searching not just the building records, but names tied to its previous ownership. Rick Wasson T., the original landlord. The property had changed hands twice in 20 years. Eventually, I found an old management company listed on a permit filing and called the number, not expecting anyone to answer. An older woman did. She told me she worked in the office years ago, before they sold the building. At first, she was cautious, but when I mentioned Walter Haynes and the unit next to mine, she went quiet in that same guarded way Rick had. Then she said, "You ran in 3B, guarantee you." That made my skin go cold. I asked how she knew. She said, because the complaints had all come from 3B, no matter who rented it. Noise next door, knocking, the sense that someone was standing in the hall behind the neighboring door. One tenant claimed he saw a hand come through the wall near the baseboard. Another insisted the shared layout was wrong, and that there was a corridor sealed inside the structure after some renovation in the 70s. When I asked about Walter, she said something I still think about all the time. She said Walter had started filing maintenance requests weeks before he died, all of them describing the same thing: movement in the walls, doorknob turning at night, someone standing just outside his apartment, but never there when he opened the door. I asked if anyone checked on him. She said they sent maintenance once and found nothing. His final written complaint, 3 days before he stopped answering, reportedly said, "It waits until I lie down." That should have been the moment I washed my hands of the entire thing, sold my furniture, abandoned the lease, accepted the financial hit, and never set foot in that building again. Instead, I did what people do when fear and logic get tangled together. I decided I needed one more piece of proof, one thing solid enough that I could bring it to police or a lawyer or anybody who wouldn't just hear haunted wall and write me off as unstable. I called Rick and told him I wanted out of the lease immediately. He said I'd have to pay penalties unless the unit was uninhabitable. I told him there was a hidden void in the wall, and I had recordings of voices coming from it. He went silent. Then he said he'd come by that evening and look at the place with maintenance. That was the first time he'd volunteered to enter at night. I should have realized what that meant. Either he finally believed me, or he already knew enough to be afraid of whatever I'd found and wanted to control how much of it got seen. Natalie refused to let me go alone, so we met Rick and one maintenance guy named Lewis in the parking lot just after sunset. Lewis looked annoyed to be there. Rick looked pale. He brought a flashlight, a pry bar, and a roll of plastic sheeting, which I noticed right away because it didn't fit the story he'd been giving me about old pipes and bad sound carry. People don't bring plastic sheeting to inspect harmless noise complaints. We went upstairs together. My apartment door stood exactly where I'd left it, and for the first few minutes, everything felt humiliatingly normal again. Rick even started to look irritated, like he'd come out for nothing. Then Lewis walked over to the shared wall where I'd removed the trim, leaned down, and said, "Why is this wet?" Lewis was crouched beside the opening with the flashlight angled into the gap, and when Rick didn't answer right away, he repeated himself, louder this time, "Why is this wet?" I moved closer before Rick could stop me. The inside edge of the wall looked darker than before, and when Lewis dragged 2 fingers along the plaster and brought them back out, they glistened in the flashlight beam. Not fresh water, thicker than that, almost oily. He rubbed his fingers against his thumb and made a face. "This isn't a leak," Rick told him to back away from it, like he'd touched something dangerous, which only made the room go tenser. Natalie looked at me, and I could tell she was already at the point where she regretted coming, but was too alarmed to leave me there. Lewis stood up and said if there was a hidden cavity in the wall, he needed to open more of it to see where the moisture was coming from. Rick started to object, then stopped. I think he realized there was no way to keep dismissing all of it. Once another person had seen something wrong with his own eyes, he told Lewis to put plastic down first. Hearing him say that in my living room, in that careful voice people use when they were trying not to trigger panic in themselves, made me feel suddenly and terribly certain that this was not new to him. Lewis spread the sheeting across the floor, while Natalie and I moved the coffee table back. Then he took the pry bar, wedged it under the loosened trim, and started peeling away a wider section of drywall. The sound of it tearing open made my teeth hurt. Dust dropped onto the plastic in little white clumps. Lewis worked quickly, muttering to himself, until there was an opening about 2 feet wide and 3 feet high between the studs. My apartment should have connected directly to the neighboring unit. There, at T, behind the wall, was a narrow passage, maybe 18 inches across, running vertically between the apartments and disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the flashlight. The interior surface wasn't framed the way modern walls are. It looked older, rougher, patched over in places, like the building had been altered around it. And then hidden, there were old pipes running along one side, rusted, nearly black. The floor of the passage was unfinished concrete, coated in dust, except for a drag mark running through it, a broad dark trail that looked disturbed recently. My strip of red tape was there too, farther in than it should have been, hanging from a jagged nail at knee height, as though someone had carefully threaded it onto the metal and left it for me to find. Natalie saw it at the same time I did and said my name in a tone that was almost a warning. Lewis leaned in farther and shined the flashlight down the passage. About 6 feet in, the beam hit something pale and irregular on the floor. For one horrible second, I thought it was a hand. Then I realized it was paper, a stack of papers, damp and stuck together, scattered as if they'd been dropped or dragged. Rick said, too quickly, that old service space was supposed to be sealed. Lewis turned and asked him what he meant supposed to be. Rick didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the opening, saw the papers, and went visibly whiter. I asked him if he'd been inside that space before. He still didn't answer. Then, from somewhere deeper in the hidden passage, there came one soft step. Everyone heard it. Lewis jerked backward hard enough to hit the kitchen counter. Natalie grabbed my arm. Rick's flashlight beam shook. No one spoke for at least 3 seconds. Then Lewis said, "There's somebody in there," in the flat, immediate tone of a person recognizing danger before the rest of us had caught up. He reached for his phone to call the police, but there was no signal. He stepped toward the window, checked again, cursed, and looked at Rick like he expected him to fix it. Another step came from inside the passage. Closer, slow, not hidden at all, deliberate in exactly the same way the footsteps had always been. When I heard them through the wall, Rick finally said, "We need to close this back up." Lewis stared at him. "There could be a person in there," Rick said it louder this time, almost sharply. "We need to close it back up now." That was the moment I stopped thinking of him as useless or evasive and started seeing something more disturbing. He was scared in a familiar way, not surprised, not skeptical, familiar. I asked him what he knew, and he snapped at me to get out of the apartment. Natalie immediately agreed. She said we were leaving, all of us, right now. Lewis still had the flashlight angled at the opening, and in that cone of light, I saw the red tape move slightly, not from air, not from gravity. It lifted, then settled, as if something deeper in the passage had brushed past it. I don't remember making the decision to step closer, but I did, maybe because I was tired of being afraid of it in pieces. Maybe because seeing the hidden corridor made me angrier than scared for one stupid second. I moved to the opening and aimed my phone flashlight beside Lewis's beam, trying to see farther in. The papers on the floor were forms, maybe maintenance requests or letters. The ink blurred, but still visible in places. Beyond them, the passage narrowed where old pipes crossed the space. Just past that, the concrete wall on the far side was covered with long vertical scratch marks, not random scoring, repeated gouges in clusters, about shoulder width apart. all facing toward my apartment. Then my light hit something else, wedged in the dark between two pipes. A face, not a full face, just enough of one to ruin the shape of every normal thought in my head. Pale skin pulled too tight over bone, one dark eye reflecting the flashlight, features flattened strangely by distance and shadow so that it looked less like a person hiding and more like the impression a person would leave if they had been pressed into a narrow space for too long. The eye blinked once. Natalie screamed. Louis stumbled back. I dropped my phone, and the thing in the passage moved forward with a wet, dragging sound that was far too fast for the pace it had always used before. The apartment lights went out all at once. The sudden dark hit all of us at once. But the thing that really broke the room open into panic was the sound that followed it. Not footsteps, not that slow pacing I'd gotten used to dreading. This was heavier and closer, a body forcing itself through a space too small for it, with a series of wet, dragging impacts against plaster and pipe. Louis shouted something I couldn't make out and swung the flashlight beam back toward the opening, just as whatever had been deeper in the passage surged forward into the edge of the light. I never saw it clearly enough to describe it in a way that sounds believable. That's the truth. What I saw was movement, first pale, narrow, wrong in its proportions, then a shoulder or the shape of one striking the exposed studs hard enough to rattle the wall, then an arm extending out of the passage with a speed that didn't match the slow, patient thing that had been pacing me for weeks. Its hand hit the plastic on the floor with a sound like soaked cloth slapping concrete. Natalie screamed my name again. I stumbled backward, half blind in the dark, and my heel caught on the edge of the sheeting. I went down hard, cracking my elbow on the floor, and before I could get up, something closed around my right ankle. It wasn't a grip like a person's. It felt too cold and too tight, the fingers long enough that they seemed to meet around the front of my leg. I kicked instinctively, twisting onto my back, and the thing pulled. I slid across the plastic toward the open wall, so fast the sheet bunched under me and tore. Louis lunged and caught me under the arms. For one horrible second, I was suspended between them, Louis dragging me backward, and something inside the passage dragging me forward with quiet, methodical strength. I remember seeing Rick in the flashlight spill, not helping, just staring with this sick recognition on his face. Then Natalie grabbed my wrist with both hands and pulled too, and the combined force must have changed something, because the grip on my ankle tightened so hard. I actually felt the bruising happen, and then slipped lower from my ankle to my shoe and tore the sneaker half off my foot. Instead of taking me with it, Louis yanked me across the floor, and all four of us fell backward in a heap as something struck the edge of the opening hard enough to crack more drywall free. The flashlight rolled in a spinning arc and settled, pointing upward, throwing crazy moving shadows across the ceiling. In that sweep of light, I saw the thing halfway out of the passage. It wasn't crawling the way a normal person would in a narrow space. It was folding itself forward in pieces, shoulders first, then head angled wrong against one arm, as if the wall behind it still had some claim on how it moved. Its skin looked pale, not like healthy skin, but like paper kept in a damp basement. The face was thin and sunken, with a dark wetness around the mouth and chin that made me think absurdly of somebody who had just come up from underwater. But the eye was the worst part. One eye fixed directly on me with the same patient attention I had felt through every wall of that apartment. Rick finally moved then. He snatched up the pry bar and slammed it sideways into the exposed studs, catching the thing across the shoulder or neck. It recoiled without making a sound, only that same dragging, cloth-wet movement, and slipped backward into the passage, just enough for Lewis to shout, "Out now!" Natalie was already on her feet. She hauled me up as Lewis grabbed the flashlight and shoved Rick toward the front door. I was limping so badly I could barely put weight on my right leg, but adrenaline covered most of it. We made it into the hallway just as something hit the inside of my apartment wall so hard the framed print near the door fell and shattered on the floor. The hall lights were still on, weak and yellow, and somehow the most comforting thing I had ever seen. Lewis slammed my apartment door behind us and braced it with his back, while Rick fumbled with his keys, not to lock it, but to get the neighboring unit open. "What are you doing?" Natalie yelled. Rick said, "It crosses through the cavity." And that was such a specific answer that even then, half hysterical and limping, I understood he had known far more than he ever admitted. He got the vacant unit open, shoved us all inside, then locked both the hall door and the connecting front door behind us. The apartment next door smelled worse than before, stronger in the dark, a mix of mildew and something older and sweeter underneath it. Lewis rounded on Rick and shouted, "What the hell is that?" Rick kept backing toward the kitchen, like he wanted a wall behind him. He said, "It started with Walter." Natalie snapped, "You think now is the time to get vague?" From the other side of the shared wall, inside my apartment, came 3 soft knocks. All 4 of us heard them. Then the same knocks sounded from inside the wall of the vacant unit where we stood, slightly farther away, as if whatever was moving through that hidden corridor had simply changed sides to follow us. Lewis swore and said we were calling the police from the parking lot if we had to. He tried his phone again. No signal. Natalie S. had none either. Mine showed a dead blank bar, like the device had never known what reception was. Then the bedroom door in the vacant unit clicked open by itself, just a few inches at first, then wider. We all stared, because there was no reason to look anywhere else. The room beyond was almost completely dark, but Lewis raised the flashlight and swept the beam across the floor. More papers, dozens of them this time, scattered around an old mattress frame, leaning against the far wall. Maintenance forms, envelopes, yellowed notebook pages, all stuck together by damp and age. The air in there felt colder, even from the doorway. Rick said, very quietly, "Don T. go in that," was the second, suspiciously specific warning he'd given, and Lewis caught it too. He said, "You've been in here before, Rick." Didn't he answer? I should have stayed where I was. but I had already spent weeks being followed by something I could never look at straight on. And there were answers in that room, or at least the shape of them. I limped past Rick before anyone could stop me and pushed the bedroom door fully open. The flashlight beam shook in Lewis's hand as he followed it in after me. The papers on the floor were all addressed to management, all maintenance complaints, all in the same blocky handwriting as the note ID found in my kitchen. Walter Haynes, the top page nearest my shoe, had only one sentence still readable through the water stains. IT uses the space between. Then something moved on the mattress frame against the wall, not behind it, on it. A pale hand folded slowly over the top edge from the other side, fingers curling down like someone hauling themselves up to look at us. Natalie screamed again. Lewis grabbed my shoulder and jerked me backward just as a face rose above the mattress frame, the same face from the passage, but clearer now, skin drawn tight and damp, one dark eye fixed on me, the mouth parting around teeth that looked too small and too numerous in the flashlight glare. And then, in Walter Haynes' own voice, or something wearing the memory of it, it said, very softly and very clearly, "You answered me for a second. None of us moved," which sounds impossible now, but I think hearing it speak did something worse than the physical attack had. Up until then, every part of my brain had still been trying to classify it as a thing, a presence, a pattern, something in the wall. The moment it used a human voice, especially one attached to a real dead man, whose name I had found in property records and complaint forms, the whole situation changed shape. It wasn't just something dangerous in a building. It was something that understood sequence, cause and effect. It understood that I had knocked on the neighboring door, that I had listened back when it knocked through the wall, that I had opened spaces I should have left sealed, that every answer I looked for had been another invitation. "What does that mean?" Natalie shouted, but her voice sounded distant to me because all my attention was fixed on the face over the mattress frame. It looked wrong in 100 small ways that were worse than obvious deformity would have been. The skin wasn't rotting. It wasn't torn. It was simply too still, stretched across the shape beneath it, like wet paper molded over bone. The dark eye never blinked. The mouth stayed slightly open after speaking, as if it were waiting for one of us to answer again. Rick made a sound behind me, not a word exactly, more like a choked refusal, and Lewis shoved all of us backward into the living room of the vacant unit, with the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls. "Out," he said, but there was nowhere obvious to go. The front door led back into the hall, and whatever had been moving through the hidden corridor seemed able to meet us from either side. The bedroom door behind us drifted another inch wider. I don't know why I looked down just then, but I did, and that probably saved us. One of Walter's complaint pages had stuck damply to the sole of my shoe. When Lewis pulled me back, it peeled away as I moved and landed face up near the doorway. Most of the page was blurred beyond reading, but a few lines remained legible, where the ink had pressed hard into the paper. "Do not let it make you answer. Do not sleep beside the shared wall. If it speaks in my voice, do Do not believe it is me. Something about seeing those instructions in handwriting, rather than hearing them secondhand, cut through the panic. Just enough for me to think clearly for the first time in several minutes. The thing in the bedroom had said, "You answered me, not I chose you, not I found you." Answered. There were rules, and I had already broken at least one by knocking, by listening, maybe even by reading and investigating. But rules also meant limits. Limits meant it could be resisted in ways that weren't purely physical. Another sound came from the bedroom. Then a soft shift of weight, followed by that dragging movement on the floorboards. Natalie backed into the kitchen counter. Louis raised the flashlight like he could use it as a weapon. Rick kept staring at the paper near my foot. I told him not to answer, he said, and that sentence lit up every suspicion ID had about him at once. I turned on him and asked who. He looked at me, then at the bedroom, and said, "The tenant before you." His voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand him. He heard it next door. He knocked back. After that, it started talking. I told him if he ignored it, it might settle. Natalie stared at him. Rick swallowed and said, "Walter figured something out before he died." Another step came from the bedroom. Closer. Louis snapped at Rick to stop talking in fragments and say what he knew. Rick finally did, maybe because the sound was getting nearer, maybe because he could hear the same thing we could. A patient approach, never rushed, never confused, like it had all the time in the world to come for us. He said Walter became convinced the hidden corridor had originally been a service chase connecting the apartments before the remodel. After he started hearing someone in the wall, he began leaving notes for management because he believed whatever was there could only move freely when invited across a threshold, not a normal threshold, a shared one. Doors, walls, openings, attention, response. Rick said Walter told him the thing used recognition like a handle. If you acknowledged it, if you answered it, if you opened spaces, it pressed against, it gained more access. That was why the knocking mattered, why the doorknob turned, why the note in my kitchen had said DONTLETITN. Then how do you stop it, I asked. Rick gave me a look I'll never forget, because it held guilt and fear in equal amounts. Walter said you had to seal the passage and give it back what it used to answer. That made no sense until I looked down at the scattered papers, all those maintenance requests, all those notes, years of written recognition, literal responses pushed under doors and filed with management, a record of being answered over and over. The thing in the bedroom spoke again then, in that same soft voice. Rick, he flinched so hard, his shoulder hit the refrigerator. "You left me," it said. "It wasn't T. Walter. I know that," but it knew exactly where to press. Rick covered his mouth with one hand, like he was fighting the urge to reply. Louis shouted at him not to say a word. I grabbed the complaint pages nearest me and started scanning for anything useful. Most were too damaged, but one line appeared again and again in different wording. Close the opening before it crosses. Burn the papers. Seal it with no answer left. That was the final action, whether I liked it or not. Not some clean escape, not calling authorities and letting them deal with it. If those pages were the accumulated chain of responses that had let it move farther each time than leaving them, there meant leaving the door open in every way that mattered. I told Lewis to find anything flammable. Natalie immediately understood before he did. She started sweeping pages into her arms, ignoring the dampness soaking into her sleeves. Lewis grabbed the plastic sheeting Rick had brought and tore off strips of it to bundle the papers tighter. Rick just stood there staring at the bedroom until the voice from inside said his name again. And this time, it sounded almost grateful. That broke him loose. He stumbled to the cabinet under the sink, found an old paint thinner, and shoved in back and handed it to me with trembling hands. The dragging sound from the bedroom accelerated. The flashlight beam caught one pale arm sliding around the doorframe into the living room. Too long, bending wrong at the elbow. Natalie cried out. Lewis swung the flashlight and hit it hard enough that the plastic casing cracked. The arm recoiled, but not far. It only folded back into shadow, gathering itself. We had seconds, maybe less. I dumped the paint thinner over the bundle of papers and shoved them toward the stripped opening in the shared wall. If the passage was how it crossed, that was where the chain had to end. Lewis flicked his lighter 3 times before it caught. When the flame took, it took fast, racing across old paper and plastic with a harsh chemical smell that filled the unit instantly. Heat slammed into my face. The fire curled inward toward the exposed passage, and from inside the bedroom came a sound I had not heard from it before. Not a scream, not exactly, but a sudden raw inhalation, as if something buried too long had finally remembered pain. The sound changed the room. Until then, even at its worst, the thing had moved with a kind of awful patience, as if time favored it. The moment the papers caught and the flame rolled into the exposed passage, that patience broke. Something slammed into the bedroom door hard enough to crack the frame, and the pale arm that had just withdrawn into the shadows came back out with sudden violent speed, groping low across the floorboards toward the burning bundle. Lewis stamped on its wrist with his boot. I heard a dry, snapping impact and saw the hand jerk sideways, but it didn't withdraw the way a person would. It kept clawing, fingers scraping blindly through the edge of the fire, smearing ash and burning paper across the plastic sheeting, as if whatever controlled it felt no pain, except at the point where the passage itself was igniting. The flames had found old dust, dry insulation, and whatever oily residue coated the hidden space, and they started crawling inward fast, licking up along the exposed studs with a harsh orange light that made all our shadows convulse against the walls. Natalie grabbed my arm and shouted that we had to go. She was right. Smoke was already thickening near the ceiling, and the chemical stench from the paint thinner burned the back of my throat. But before any of us could move, the thing came all the way out. Not with a leap, not with anything as clean as that. It unfolded from the bedroom darkness in pieces, driven less by muscle than by desperate momentum, dragging itself across the floor with both arms, while its lower body twisted behind it, like it was still half caught in a narrower place. In the firelight, it looked less like Walter Haynes than before. That was somehow worse. The human resemblance was still there. The shape of a face, the slope of shoulders, the outline of clothing degraded into strips and wet folds. But now I could see that it wasn't he imitating a dead tenant so much as wearing the idea of one over something much older and emptier beneath. The skin wasn't he decayed. It was thinned, stretched, and darkened in patches the way paper browns, where damp has dried and returned too many times. And when it opened its mouth, I saw why the voice had always sounded slightly wrong on the recordings. There was movement inside before sound came out, multiple small motions too quick and layered to belong to one tongue, as if it had built speech of repetition rather than anatomy. Rick made the mistake then, the fatal, stupid, human mistake. It looked at him through the smoke and said, in Walter S. voice again, "Please." Rick answered, without meaning to. Just one word. No, the effect was immediate. The thing S head snapped toward him, not like it had heard a sound, but like something invisible had been handed across the room and hooked directly into it. It changed direction so quickly Lewis barely had time to shove Natalie and me aside. It launched itself at Rick with a wet, sliding impact that drove him backward into the kitchen cabinets. He screamed once, high and shocked, as its hands closed around his shoulders and throat, and began dragging him toward the exposed wall passage with impossible force. Lewis swung the broken flashlight like a club and hit it in the side of the head. I heard another cracking impact, but the thing only flinched and tightened its hold on Rick. He clawed at the counter edge, heels skidding, eyes bulging with a terror so naked it erased every lie and deflection he'd ever given me. Natalie seized the pry bar off the floor and jammed it between the thing S arm and Rick S chest. For 1 second, the leverage worked. Its grip loosened. Rick slipped partly free. Then the thing S free hand snapped out and caught my injured ankle again. Pain shot up my leg so hard my vision whited out. I went down on one knee, and the pull started immediately, low and steady, straight toward the burning opening in the wall. That was the near-death part, if you want the truth of it, not the sight of it, not even the voice. It was the certainty in that grip, the feeling that if I slid another 3 feet, it would get me into that burning passage, and nobody would ever be able to pull me back out, because that space belonged to it in some fundamental way that our side of the wall never had. I clawed at the floor. Lewis grabbed me under the arms again. Natalie let go of the pry bar long enough to catch my wrist. Rick, coughing and half-choked, stared at me for one stunned beat, and then did the only decent thing I ever saw him do. He kicked the can of paint thinner, still sloshing with a little left in the bottom, directly into the exposed opening. The metal struck the studs, tipped, and dumped the rest into the fire. The flare that followed was immediate and violent, a hard burst of heat and orange light that roared inward through the passage, like it had found a chimney waiting for it. The thing convulsed, not recoiled, convulsed, as if the fire had suddenly reached some deeper part of it, farther inside the walls, and transmitted pain through every false shape. It had stretched into our apartment. The grip on my ankle spasmed once and loosened. Louis and Natalie hauled me backwards so fast, my shirt rode up against the floor. Rick was already stumbling for the front door, coughing so hard he could barely stay upright. Smoke had dropped low by then. The kitchen ceiling was blackening. Somewhere in the wall, behind the fire, something began pounding rapidly. Not 3 deliberate knocks anymore, but a frantic battering from multiple points at once, racing between studs, ceiling, and floor, as if it no longer cared about being heard, only about getting out before the passage sealed in flame. We ran, not in any organized way. We just crashed out through the vacant Unit S door into the hallway and kept moving. Louis half-carried Rick. Natalie dragged me down the hall with one arm around my waist, while I hopped and stumbled on my good leg. Behind us, both apartment doors shook in their frames as something hit from the inside. Then, above the crackle of growing fire, I heard it speak one last time through the wall, in a chorus of borrowed voices, layered over each other. Walter S. and one I thought might have been the tenant before me, and something thin and female I had never heard before saying the same phrase out of sync, until it became meaningless sound. Don T, leave me here. We made it to the stairwell as the first alarm finally started blaring. By the time we got outside, people were pouring into the parking lot in slippers and coats, confused and angry and coughing. Someone called 911 from the street and got through immediately. That detail still bothers me. No signal inside, full service outside. Fire trucks arrived in less than 10 minutes, but the crews never found any person in either apartment. They found fire damage, smoke, charred paperwork, a blown open section of shared wall, and an old sealed service chase that, according to the report, should have been fully inaccessible after the 70s remodel. They also found scratch marks running the entire length of the interior concrete, all facing toward my apartment. Rick gave a statement, and then, 2 days later, broke down enough to tell me the rest. Years ago, after Walter died, management had discovered that many of his written complaints were never filed, because Rick then, just an assistant, thought the old man was confused and difficult. He had answered some of them in writing, slid notes back under the door, even knocked on the wall once to prove nobody was there. After Walter died, the next tenant in my unit started hearing the same pacing. Rick recognized the pattern and panicked. Instead of reporting everything, he had maintenance seal openings, repaint walls, and rent around the problem. Walter, it turned out, had figured out more than anyone else. The thing wasn't his ghost. It had been in that dead service space long before him, something that needed acknowledgement to cross boundaries. Walter had only given it a better voice. All those answers, knocks, notes, maintenance responses, people opening walls and calling into empty rooms, had fed it a path from one apartment into the next, burning the complaint pages. And the exposed passage, didn't he destroy it completely? Rick was honest about that, but it cut the route. It had using for years, and the building owners sealed the entire chase with concrete afterward. Rick paid my lease out himself. He sold the property 6 months later. He died the next winter of a stroke, and I'd be lying if I said I never wondered whether he kept hearing knocking in whatever house he moved to. As for me, I graduated late after dropping 2 classes and spending months sleeping with lamps on. The bruises around my ankle took weeks to fade. One finger-shaped mark stayed yellow under the skin long after the others were gone. I live in a different city now, in a newer building with thicker walls, and most nights I can almost believe the whole thing was some grotesque accident of architecture and guilt and isolation. Almost, because every now and then, usually after I've lived somewhere long enough to stop checking the corners before bed, I hear a slow set of footsteps in the apartment next door that stop exactly when I stop moving. And if I get home late and stand too long outside my own door, I can sometimes see the darkness under the neighboring unit change shape, as if someone on the other side has stepped closer, waiting to see whether I've learned anything at all.